Today we're testing out autofocus on the Fujifilm X-T4, and what we really want to know is if the continuous autofocus is actually usable for video. Now the lens that we're going to be using for all of my tests today is the brand new Viltrox 23mm F1.4 lens. So right now I'm shooting on the X-T4 with the Viltrox 23mm lens set to f1.8, so a pretty good shallow depth of field, and I have continuous autofocus turned on with eye detection turned on. So let's do a couple simple autofocus tests right now, going from my face to a focus chart, and there we go, it snapped onto it. Nope, it hunted to the background. Let's see if it goes back to my face. It looks like it has. Okay, so some reason it'll pull focus to this for a moment. Oh, it doesn't like it, and it goes right back to the background. And maybe that's because there's a bunch of contrast behind with these lights. A lot of times autofocus really struggles with strong backlights. Even if your subject is lit well, like this focus chart in my face is. See, it's snapping to it and then right back to the background, which is weird. I have found that it keeps getting back to my face though, which is good. Honestly, I think it's the bright background lights behind me that's keeping this focus chart from staying actually crisp and in focus. It just keeps focusing to the background instead of what's directly in front of it. So now with that practical light turned off, let's see if it'll focus to the chart. Nope. It grabs it for a second, hunts, and then poof, back to the background. So it's not liking that. Let's turn the other one off and see what we get. Here we go, just pretty much a dark abyss behind me with only my key light turned on. So let's go to the chart. What is happening? It can't hold focus on the chart. This system honestly is just really struggling, and I don't know if it's the specific lens or if it's autofocus on the X-T4. I'd have to try a bunch more lenses, I think. Now, the autofocus settings that I've found to work the best and give the nicest results on the X-T4 with this 23mm lens is with the sensitivity turned to 0, which is the best and most sensitive, which seems strange that it's 0, but it is, and the autofocus tracking speed set to 5, which is the quickest speed possible. It'd be, of course, better to have a nice smooth rack focus, but I dialed through all the different settings in speed, and it never really looks smooth, it just goes really slow. All right, let's do another autofocus test of me just popping in and out of frame to see how good the eye autofocus is at snapping onto my face from the background. This test is funny. Woo! Okay, I think it does a pretty good job with the eye autofocus. You can see the little square around my eye. It does a pretty good job of tracking it. Sometimes it does hunt around, especially if you get off center. It may hunt to the background, but it looks like it does a pretty good job in general. Okay, another autofocus test, moving towards the camera and away from the camera. How well does it keep your face in focus when you are far away from the camera and you start moving towards it? Is it quick enough to keep focus? This is a big deal because if you do a lot of vlogs and such, you might not be right in front of your camera stationary all the time. You got to be able to move around and have it keep autofocus, especially if you like to film standing and walking and moving around instead of being in a chair. It's important that the autofocus keeps up. So let's see just how good this actually is walking around. And what if I'm not looking at the camera? Where does the focus go? And does it get the focus back when I turn back around? These are some simple things that we've just gotta know. So I decided to do the autofocus test again between my face and the chart. And you can see now it's grabbing onto the chart just fine and going right back to my face. But earlier, it couldn't do this at all. It was only going to the background. So I feel like it's kind of hit or miss. Could be your lighting, could just be the way the autofocus is feeling at the moment. But you can see it's grabbing the chart in my face again just fine. No issues with that at all. So why it's working now and wasn't working earlier, just couldn't say. Boom, boom. Obviously this chart has a ton of contrast in it. That's why it's used for focusing. So let's try it from the other side without all that contrast, just a black side. And it's still pulling that pretty quick. Yeah, so it's not just the focus chart, it's actually pulling it from this really well. So yeah, I don't know, it's really weird. It's kind of been hit or miss for me. It's pulling up this chart totally fine now, whereas you saw in the test earlier, it couldn't do it at all. It kept focusing to the background, and I don't know if it's because the lighting's a little bit different now or what. So I want to show you guys in here changing the autofocus settings from what they are right now. And that's what tracking sensitivity 0. So instead of it being 0, let's turn it all the way up to 4. It's the least amount of sensitivity. And then autofocus speed from the fastest, which is 5, all the way down to -5, our slowest speed. So let's see what that looks like now. So we're gonna do that chart test again. Yeah, you can definitely tell a lag there. I'm looking up at the monitor again because to see if it catches focus. Now, there's definitely a lag going from the chart to my face. It's definitely slower. And that was slower for sure. So nowhere near as snappy. Let's try walking away from the camera and towards it. Just want to see how snappy and good the autofocus is with these settings that are completely on the other end of the spectrum, complete opposite to what I had them set to earlier. I've got my Rode mic on, and so I don't know how the audio is sounding. Hopefully it's not too bad. But anyways, so how good is the autofocus staying on my face? And of course I'm at arm's length. So we want to know too, is this a good lens for vlogging if you do this kind of thing? I mean, it's a 23mm, which is a 35mm equivalent on a full frame, and I think it's just probably not quite wide enough. It's pretty wide, but probably not wide enough for vlogging. I prefer more of like a 16mm, which gives you a 24mm equivalent. But how's it looking? How's the stabilization in general on the camera and the autofocus? Is it staying on my face? I'm just wandering around the park. I probably look like that crazy person now. The people are like, kids, stay away, hide. There's a crazy guy walking around talking to himself. Yeah, I mean, based on what I'm seeing so far, just looking at the flip out screen here, which I love having, thank heavens they produced a good camera with a flip out screen. I swear there has not been a good camera with a flip out screen in a while, so really nice to have. When I'm shooting professional client videos and I'm getting paid to do that work, I typically don't rely on autofocus. I'm manually focusing just about every shot. But from the results that I've seen on the X-T4 with this lens in specific, I think that the autofocus is definitely usable, especially for something like this. It's just a simple talking head and I might be moving in and out a little bit and it's well lit. But if you get into some lighting scenarios where the lighting is really changing, or you have a really bad hard backlight or a lot of shadows on the face and the subject isn't really well lit, your autofocus is definitely going to struggle. But that's pretty much on any camera where it's not well lit. I've found that the autofocus can struggle. Some obviously handle it better. I think my Sony a6500 definitely has a better autofocus system than the X-T4, but this is usable in my opinion for this sort of setup. But in reality, I don't think I would rely on autofocus with this camera when I'm getting paid to do that work, and it has to be right the first time and there's no second chance to get it in focus and get it right. I am using the latest firmware update on the X-T4, which I believe is 1.02. So maybe in the future, they will continue to add more updates to improve the autofocus. Now, we've talked a lot about autofocus on the X-T4. Let's talk about the lens now. Viltrox is just getting started in the lens manufacturing business. They haven't been around nearly as long as Canon or Fuji or Nikon or anyone else that has been making glass. But in my opinion, they're off to a fantastic start. This is the second Viltrox lens that I have actually reviewed. The other one was the 85mm full frame lens, and that thing is beautiful, gets wide open, gorgeous, shallow depth of field. fantastic lens. And this one does not disappoint either. It's very similar to that. It has a full metal build, so the construction of it is actually really good, and it has an incredibly shallow depth of field at f1.4, which is fantastic, especially on these wide angle lenses, so you can get really close to the lens and have that background blur out really nicely. I love that. It's a really great look. And of course it does fantastic in low light. So if you're doing a lot of live events or weddings or things like that, this is just a great lens to bring along with you because it's going to let in so much light. Something that I really like about X-mount lenses is that they typically put an aperture ring on them, so you can actually adjust your aperture without going into any of the settings. Now, the aperture ring is actually fully electronic, so when you spin it, if the lens is dismounted, it won't actually change the aperture. So it's not technically fully manual, it's using electronics to change the aperture. But it's fantastic that you can just reach up and change your aperture without going into any settings or spinning any dials or anything like that. The focus ring turns really smoothly and it has a decent throw to it. They also include a lens hood which screws into place nice and easily, and it doesn't pop off if you hit it. Same goes for the lens cap. It's an APS-C crop sensor lens, so it's of course not going to work with any other full frame cameras, and it's X-mount, so it's not adaptable to any other mirrorless cameras or Canon cameras or anything like that. It's only going to work on a Fujifilm camera. Let's see if there's any vignetting on this lens and how apparent it is, because when you get to the wider angle lenses, they tend to vignette more. When it comes to price, I actually think that this lens is a really good deal at only $330 on Amazon. If you want the official Fujifilm 23mm lens, it's gonna run you $450. I haven't actually tested out autofocus on the Fujifilm 23mm lens yet, but it's definitely something I'd like to compare to this one in the future and see if it's any better or if they're pretty much comparable. I definitely think this lens is worth picking up, especially if you're just switching over to Fujifilm and you're not ready to start investing in all new expensive X-mount glass. This is a great budget-friendly way to go. I want to hear from you guys. Do you think continuous autofocus on the X-T4 is usable for video? And if it is, what lens are you using that's giving you a really good result? Leave a comment below and I'll definitely be replying to all of them. And guys, if you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe right now because I have a ton more videos coming out on lighting, shooting, editing, gear reviews, everything like that, and you don't want to miss them. All right, I'll see you in the next video.